All right, I like to say, the first thing I like to say is that I know that everybody here came for this free lunch and not to hear this, this lecture. But while you're eating this lunch, especially for the students, I started, because it's funny to be called a new voice, because I started graduate school when I was 20 years old, 22 years ago in Philadelphia. And as a first-year graduate student, PhD student, one of the first things they told us in Philadelphia, I had a $7,000 a year stipend, and I was living in North Philadelphia, was that you better take as many free lunches as Temple University offered. And I found out through 5 years of struggling and living in Philadelphia that they were right, that the free lunches were really part of your graduate school experience. So forgive me for blathering on while you're eating a good lunch to all the graduate students here. Before, I'm going to sort of read and sort of just speak contemporaneously. But the first thing I want to say is that we're at a critical moment in American history. In the introduction, it was mentioned that it's the 150th anniversary of emancipation, the end of the Civil War. And at Tufts, my Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, we've organized on March 4th and 5th a two-day conference called Freedom Dreams that looks at 1865, 1965, 2015. And the reason why this is such a critical moment is because during these anniversary years, we tend to commemorate, at times celebrate, where we've been and how far we've come. And when we think about the past 150 years and the past 50 years, there's this creative tension between protest and policy, between demonstrations and between demonstrations that in a very specific way have policy implications. When we think about whether it's the anti-slavery movement, when we think about the suffrage movement, when we think about gay marriage, these are all social protest movements, civil rights movements that are connected to policy implications that affect people's life chances. Sometimes as social scientists, we talk about political economy, but all we're talking about are life chances across the board in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, the criminal justice system, where people live, what access their children, and really their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to have. So the reason why this is so important, and even this phrase, Black Lives Matter, from Black Power to Black Lives Matter, from civil rights to Black Lives Matter, is the way in which social protests or social justice movements interact with policy, and policy on a number of different levels. And I think in the Q&A we can get to that. Okay, so let us begin. And one small thing about my background, because as mentioned in terms of the son of Haitian immigrants, I am the proud son of Haitian immigrants. My mother, Jermaine Joseph, came to this country in 1965. I was on my first picket line at 8 years old in New York City. So the way in which I come to the study of both history and political affairs, public affairs, policy, is really in a deeply personal way. I grew up in a household where people talked about social and political justice in very, very specific ways, but they were participant observers. So my mother was somebody who attended rallies and demonstrations and took me and my older brother to those things. So I come to this in a very, very specific way. But I think there's a way in which you can have deeply personal experiences that are also deeply professional and intellectual, so you can bridge that gap. So the title of this talk is From Selma to Ferguson, Race and Public Policy in the Age of Obama. Everyone suddenly is discussing race, from protesters to policymakers, from the Attorney General to the FBI Director to, begrudgingly, the President of the United States. In the aftermath of Ferguson, Eric Garner, Black Lives protests, there's been a sea change in the way in which we think and talk about race. We have yet to see what the official policy implications are going to be to this sea change, but we can hint at some of them through what's already been announced. On December 1st of last year, the president announced $263 million in federal funding for body cameras. The Attorney General also announced a series of meetings with law enforcement and communities to promote better understanding. Just today, the Coalition for Public Safety announced a 3-year bipartisan effort to reduce our nation's bursting prison system. that includes cooperation with the Center for American Progress and the Koch brothers. So that's strange bedfellows. We've got the proposed REDEEM Act by Cory Booker and Rand Paul, which is to assist nonviolent offenders, especially juvenile offenders, to seal their records. And this really follows local efforts that I've been a part of and other people have been a part of in places like Massachusetts for quarry reform or criminal record reform in Massachusetts. Texas's own John Cornyn and Rhode Island Sheldon Whitehouse have introduced legislation to reduce prisons by making certain prisoners eligible for release. When we think about Ferguson, and don't worry, I'm going to talk about voting rights too, but when we think about Ferguson, Ferguson is a result of not just inequality in the criminal justice system, but decades of public policy choices that go back to before the heroic period of the civil rights movement. And what I call the heroic period of the civil rights movement, 54 to 65, from Brown to the Voting Rights Act and the epical struggles and political legislation and legal decisions of that time period. When we think about what were some of the policy roots of Ferguson, a few things. Government-sponsored dual labor markets, government regulators' support for real estate and financial sector policies and practices that at times explicitly promoted racial segregation, restrictive covenants, which excluded African Americans from white areas, racially explicit zoning decisions that designated specific African American neighborhoods to be basically ghetto boundaries outside of St. Louis County. Boundary, annexation, spot zoning, and municipal incorporation policies designed to remove African Americans from neighborhoods near African Americans from residences near white neighborhoods. Urban renewal, which as early as the 1960s was called Negro removal by political activists, and redevelopment programs that shift black presence at times within inner city cores, and at times, when we think about Ferguson and slum clearance in St. Louis County, to suburbs that are going to be predominantly poor and marginalized. As Richard Rothstein reminds us about Ferguson, quote, "A century of evidence that demonstrates that St. Louis was segregated by interlocking and racially explicit public policies of zoning, public housing, and suburban finance, and by publicly endorsed segregation policies of the real estate, banking, and insurance industries. These governmental policies interacted with public labor market and employment policies that denied blacks access to jobs available to comparably skilled whites. When these mutually reinforcing public policies conspired with private prejudice to turn St. Louis's African American communities into slums, public officials raised those slums to create more profitable uses. Blacks were displaced then, relocated to other places, converting towns like Ferguson into newly segregated enclaves," close quote. 55 years ago this month, 4 black North Carolina A&T students launched a lunch counter sit-in at Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina. This sparked a political and policy revolution. A sit-in that began with 4 people grew to include more than 50,000 participants by the end of the spring of 1960, inaugurating the direct action phase of the civil rights era and leading to the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That history and its contemporary policy reverberations continue to surround us. Even before the attention surrounding Ferguson, Missouri, we've seen local municipalities struggle. And a great example of this is going to be North Carolina with Moral Mondays, in terms of social justice rallies that are designed to combat different states' rightward legislative lurch into repressive policies against African Americans, the poor, and those lacking health care. Moral Mondays movement advocates a range of issues that focus in the main on transforming public school, providing health care for all citizens, reforming criminal justice, fighting poverty, and guaranteeing voting rights. The Attorney General of the United States has been outspoken vis-a-vis transforming federal policies vis-a-vis the DOJ and the justice system. This is very important, and this precedes Ferguson. In 2013, in the summer of 2013, Eric Holder announced different policies that at the federal level would prevent people who were convicted on drug charges of serving mandatory minimum sentences, and he announced policies that would provide federal prosecutors more discretion and leeway. People are still pushing, and policy activists and civil rights activists are still pushing for an executive order that would order a comprehensive review of DOJ Ed Byrne grants. And when we think about the Byrne grants, and we've got, I don't know if David is here. Did David come to the talk? David Springer? No? I'm going to get on him for not being here at the talk. I'm going to say I gave you a shout out and you were missing in action. David Springer's work in terms of neighborhood restoration that's connected to the Obama administration, he's on a DOJ grant right now. The Brennan Center for Law at NYU, and I've written about this, has been advocating something called success-oriented criminal justice grants. Because when we think about the DOJ grants, they're some of the biggest drivers for mass incarceration in the United States right now, because they incentivize state and local municipalities to actually bring in more black and brown bodies. And that's what we might call an unintended consequence of different, whether it's the 1986 anti-crime bill, and different legislative policies that were supposed to curtail crime and drugs. So it's a casualty of the drug war. Holder has called for a repeal of voter restrictions that prevent. Well, Holder has also called for a repeal of voting restrictions that prevent almost 6 million ex-felons, more than a third of whom are black, from voting. Holder rightfully acknowledges the law's despicable origins and racial injustice that stretches back to America's bullwhip days of antebellum slavery. Quote, although well over a century has passed since post-Reconstruction states used these measures to strip African Americans of their most fundamental rights, the impact of felony disfranchisement on modern communities of color remains both disproportionate and unacceptable, he said. The interesting thing about when we think about voting rights and felony disfranchisement and efforts at criminal justice reform are the connections. There's going to be real connections between, when we think about Selma to Ferguson, between voting and the criminal justice system. The Attorney General's contention that such laws are not in keeping with our democratic values underscores the way in which the past, especially America's unrepentant history of Jim Crow racism, animates virtually every contemporary debate and policy discussions about race, citizenship, and equality. Racism is not just simply in the nation's DNA, it arranges the way in which our institutions and policies interact with citizens. In the popular imagination, the successful passage of civil rights legislation fundamentally eradicated institutional racism. From this view, contemporary black America has only itself to blame for its plight. It's a comforting myth and one that keeps both white and blacks at times warm at night, but it's a gross distortion of the hard empirical evidence on the ground. And when we think about policy at the presidential level, at the executive level, Barack Obama's My Brother's Keeper, which is a White House initiative aimed at bolstering opportunities for economically vulnerable and racially segregated black men, is one more acknowledgement that we have yet to reach the post-racial state of grace prematurely declared in the immediate aftermath of the 2008 presidential election. And My Brother's Keeper is interesting because it's really using private money to try to promote better black educational attainment over a 5-year period, $200 million. He's been criticized on a number of levels. It's not coming from the federal government. People want black girls included and young black women included. But I think it's important because it's at least an acknowledgement by the president that there needs to be some kind of federal action connected to that. When we think about the civil rights movement helped convene a national policy conversation about race and democracy that pushed us towards a multiracial and multicultural society. Decades later, it still provides enduring lessons about the contours of American democracy. When we think about from Selma to Ferguson, one of the things that we've seen in the light of the movie Selma coming out, March 7th is going to be the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. March 9th is going to be Turnaround Tuesday, March 15th of this year, is LBJ's joint address to Congress, where he ends that speech by saying, "We shall overcome." But he also talks about that we're at a very specific point in American history, and he says, for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy, we've got to move forward on voting rights and citizenship. And the interesting thing about the Johnson speech to the joint address of Congress is that he says that the activists in Selma are part of a long tradition, puts them in the context of the founding fathers, and connects what happened in Selma, and this is 8 days after Bloody Sunday, to Lexington and Concord, two of the most pivotal battles of the American Revolution. So that's very, very important in that context. And in that sense, he's following Martin Luther King Jr., of course, who in Letter from Birmingham Jail in 1963, in April, says that the young people who are protesting in Birmingham, Alabama, are bringing the nation back to what King calls those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the founding fathers. So that's very, very pivotal, too. When we think about this narrative of racial progress since Selma, on one level, there's good news all around us in the size of the black middle class, in the emergence of an entrepreneurial black business leaders, in political and cultural figures. We all know the names: Oprah Winfrey, Beyonce, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Jay-Z. I'm going to add Tiger Woods, even if he doesn't want to be added. It's one big family. I'm going to add him, even if he doesn't want to be added. Barack Obama's status towers over the nation as a symbolic and substantive example of the long journey from the harsh night of racial segregation into the glorious morning of equal opportunity. Almost 50 years after Selma, when we think about the 2012 presidential election, we saw the impact of the Voting Rights Act on the lives of real Americans. For the first time in American history in 2012, black voter turnout surpassed the rate of white voters. U.S. Census Bureau data says that 66.2% of blacks turned out to vote, in contrast to 64.1% of non-Hispanic whites, which represents a potential game changer in American politics. I'm not reaching the Shelby decision yet, so let's just stay in 2012. While black voter turnout increased by roughly 1.8 million from the 2008 presidential election, white participation declined by about 2 million. And a lot of that 1.8 million was also increased turnout about on some levels of black men, but black women. Black women are the unsung heroes of black voter turnout, and also black voter participation and organization. Black women are the organizers when we think about voting rights organizers really in the United States, even though a lot of times black men take credit for that. And that's a running theme in African American history. When we think about the 2012 election, Democrats have hailed the results as an opportunity to build an enduring coalition led by racial minorities aligned with a plurality of white voters. Republicans, who have vowed to increase their share of the Hispanic vote, maintain a stubborn insistence that robust black participation is only the result of Obama. So it's the Obama phenomenon. Once Obama is not president, the black folks aren't going to turn out. And we're empirically, the only way we can tell, because there's perpetually low voter turnout in midterm elections, is going to be 2016. What both of these narratives dismiss is the political intelligence and sophistication of black voters. They are among the most issue-oriented voters in America, relying less on racial and ethnic affiliations than on substantive policy and programmatic initiatives. For a generation of black voters, the civil rights movement served as a national classroom that taught enduring lessons about race and democracy. Voter education projects in the South and North resisted efforts to deny the black vote, and sought to convince residents in some of America's most dangerous and poverty-stricken neighborhoods that their voices were powerful enough to be heard. And a great example of this is when we think about the civil rights movement in a very concrete way. Voting rights efforts were not just things like the Voter Education Project, but in places like Lowndes County, the buckle of Alabama's Black Belt, you had voting rights activists, including Stokely Carmichael, who were teaching civic lessons, and in places that were where people lacked what we think of as formal literacy, people were using pamphlets and cartoons to connect how voting could help schools, could help pave roads, and why voting was not what some sharecroppers said white man's business, how voting was really part of a civic religion in the United States that would include African Americans. While the Democratic Party currently receives the majority of the black vote, this has not always been the case. Civil rights activists in Mississippi and Alabama organized separate independent parties, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was nicknamed the Black Panther Party, to outflank the Democratic Party's resistance to black citizenship. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, that relationship had undergone profound changes through a combination of racial backlash against civil rights legislation and bruising struggles toward a more open and inclusive party. Democrats found themselves identified primarily with the struggles of black and poor people. And certainly this is Barbara Jordan week, and Barbara Jordan figures into this struggle to transform the Democratic Party in very, very profound ways. For a while, as exemplified by George McGovern's crushing defeat in 1972, this seemed like a formula for failure, with Democrats losing 5 of 6 presidential elections between 1968 and 1988. Yet Dr. King's dream of multiracial democracy did not die. In retrospect, it was simply deferred, a sleeping giant waiting for demographic changes to come. The shifts in white and black voting patterns suggest that the Democratic Party has yet to recover from its identification in the minds of many white voters as being primarily concerned with civil rights. But demographic changes, sometimes we call it the browning of America, coupled with increased voter participation among blacks and Hispanics, have turned the party into a majority presidential party in 4 of the last 6 presidential elections. When we think about I'm going to skip that part. The historic makeup of Obama's coalition can be directly traced back to events that took place in Selma. When we think about 1965 becomes a turning point. But a half a century later, race relations between blacks and whites, an overly simplistic binary that nonetheless resonates along a continuum that sees various racial minorities grouped by skin color, remains contested. Obama's election was greeted with an initial burst of euphoria that unleashed the myth of post-racialism, backed by optimistic assessments that race mattered less than ever before in American life. Soon, however, some commentators began highlighting enduring racial animosity. In 2012, only 39% of whites voted for Obama, a decline of 4 percentage points from 2008. That total was lower than for John Kerry in 2004 and Michael Dukakis in 1988, but it still surpassed McGovern's dismal 1972 showing of 32%. So we can always take heart in the fact that Obama did better than George McGovern with the white voters in 1972. When we, very, very quickly, because I want to get into Ferguson, when we think about where we've come 50 years between Selma and Ferguson, I think, and hopefully we can get to this in questions and answers too, one of the biggest things I want to stress is the connection between when we think about the policy implications of the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts and what we're now facing in terms of mass incarceration. Because we have to think of policy as going on 2 parallel tracks. During the heroic period of the Civil Rights Movement, and in a way we can say it ends posthumously with Federal Open Housing Act in 68. We have all this legislation between the Brown decision, between the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Open Housing Act, and even things like the Freedom Rides were there to test existing legislation about segregation on interstate travel and interstate transport. Paralleling that between post-1965 all the way to the present was the confluence of decades of policy making and laws that actually reinforced residential segregation, that actually reinforced labor market segmentation, that actually introduced new and more punitive justice measures that implicate all of us, whether it's our schools, whether it's our local politics, our municipal politics, our neighborhoods, that implicate all of us in actually reinforcing and amplifying racial segregation, right? And amplifying the very segregation that the public policy during the heroic period of the civil rights movement was designed to eliminate. Okay, very quickly, I want to discuss this idea of mass incarceration and then sort of conclude. Between 1980 and 2015, we've gone from 350,000 people in the federal, state, and local prisons to 2.4 million. Certainly, the legal scholar Michelle Alexander has called this phenomenon the new Jim Crow, and her argument is that the war on drugs became a war on poor African Americans through nonviolent drug offenders getting felony convictions that served as a mechanism of disfranchisement. By 2007, there were more African Americans who were implicated in prison, parole, and probation than who were enslaved under slavery when we look at census data from 1850. So one of the major problems that we face in the last 50 years between Selma and Ferguson is this issue of not just criminal justice, but the criminal justice system's connection to different democratic institutions in our society, right? And so when we think about this issue of mass incarceration, it is the civil rights issue of our time. When we think about mass incarceration. And mass incarceration is connected to so many different other justice issues, but for those of us who are interested in civil rights policy, it's a game changer, because what mass incarceration has done, and this has been bipartisan, this has been Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and the Obama administration has done two things. On one side, it's tried to ameliorate mass incarceration, but on the other side, it's been unwilling to do the radical changes that are necessary, especially at the Department of Justice, and especially through the DOJ burn grants, that would be a game changer in terms of having real trickle-down effect on what states do to not just promote mass incarceration, but giving states billions of dollars to promote having less people in prison, rehabilitation, and actually keeping families together. So when we think about public policy over especially the last 35 years, some of the things that policy has done is resulted in African Americans are 14% of the population, yet they're 32% of all arrests. They are 45% of all felony defendants in the largest 75 U.S. counties. They are 38% of the jail population, 37% of federal prisoners, and 49% of those on death row. What we've seen in terms of race and policy during the Obama administration is an attempt to ameliorate this. Probably one of the biggest is the 2010 Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparities between those who are convicted of crack cocaine and powder cocaine from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. But those disparities still disproportionately affect African Americans, because African Americans are 80% of defendants who are accused of selling crack cocaine. They are 27% of defendants who are accused of selling powdered cocaine. So what's interesting in 2015 is that we've got the policy implications of this are very, very clear in terms of racial disparities, even though the way in which the policies are written, whether you think about drug forfeiture laws, whether you think about mandatory minimums, whether you think about different crime bills that were enacted both during the Reagan administration, but also Clinton, and the welfare reform is connected to this too. They are colorblind policies, but the implications and the reverberations and the outcomes are racially disparate in ways that if this was happening to white Americans, it would be catastrophic in terms of what the country would do, and it would be all hands on deck. So in a way, the interesting thing about when we think about from Selma to Ferguson is that the disparate policy impact in terms of African Americans, especially vis-a-vis the criminal justice system, on one level, it reinforces a casual racism in the sense of saying, well, of course there's a lot of black people in jail. You know, they commit most of the crimes, which is not true. But it's the same thing connected to Ferguson, where people say, well, why is Ferguson an all African-American suburb, or 66% African-American, people will say, well, whites just didn't want to live there, and that's where blacks live. Well, no, there's real policy implications here. People were fed into, Ferguson became a suburb, a poor suburb of last resort. What whites did around St. Louis County is even annex parts of poorer counties and raise homes and turn those into playgrounds because they could, and they had the legal and political and economic power to do so, right? So when we think about these outcomes, on one level, these outcomes reinforce a kind of individual racism where you say, of course, 49% of black people are on death row. They're just killing each other. And I've had, talks where people ask me, what about the black on black crime? Well, it's 93% and the white on white crime is 84%, but no one wants to talk about so-called white on white crime, right? So when we see this reinforcement of the casual racism, it hides the policy implications, that the reason why we see these unequal power relations, and as we speak, African-American median income is 60% of white income, but the deeper story is that African-American wealth is 5% of white wealth, right? And that most of white and black wealth is connected to home ownership, and what we're seeing is from the New Deal to the post-war Great Society, what the Federal Housing Authority did in a policy way, and we've had all these great policy books by Kenneth Jackson and so many others who in a meticulous way discuss this, and then the long-form essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Case for Reparations, sort of used this as well, is the way in which the federal government subsidized single-family houses for whites and disallowed. There's a point in the 1940s, the FHA is building 80% of the houses in the United States, and the African Americans are not gaining access to this. So there's something residual. There's by 1950 in St. Louis County, the average home is twice the median income. Now it is 7 and 8 times the median income. So that wealth creation between 1950 and 2015, African Americans for the most part have been excluded from that wealth creation. And my final anecdote here is going to be something that's close to home for me as a New Yorker, is going to be Peter Cooper Stuyvesant Town. And Peter Cooper Stuyvesant Town in New York City was built with federal money that MetLife was supposed to sort of be the host of it. The punchline is MetLife sold this off a few years ago for $5.4 billion. But the government did the subsidized housing, 25,000 apartments on what we might consider the Lower East Side now, First Avenue and 14th, and it's the Peter Cooper Stuyvesant Town. It's a great place. I've lived there, and it was supposed to be for affordable, anybody was supposed to be able to get it. That was built by 1947. Initially, out of the 25,000 apartments, not a single African-American family is allowed to move in, not a single. And this is a government-sponsored housing. After raucous protests in New York City, there's going to be about 60 African-American families who are allowed to move in and have that subsidized housing. And the people who were excluded included veterans. It included veterans who were excluded. So when we think about that exclusion from affordable housing in New York City dating back to the 1940s, right? This is connected. These weren't just private decisions. These were policy decisions. And even when we think about the Truman administration and the Housing Act of 1949, the Housing Act of 1949 provides money, but it lets local states decide how to use that money, and local municipalities build segregated housing, right? And even some of the supporters of public housing said, well, if we try to make this integrated housing, we're not going to get this bill passed, we're not going to get the money, and we need money, so let's do it this way. But these have had major, major consequences that continue to haunt us now. So I'll close by saying, when we think about this idea of race and public policy in the age of Obama, and from Selma to Ferguson, the policy implications of this are on how we all live, whether we're middle class, upper middle class. You guys are public policy students, both at the domestic level and the international level, and there's a whole global piece to this that we could talk about in the Q&A as well. The policy implications are profound because this affects citizenship and small d democracy. The reason why the civil rights movement now is so often lauded, and King is lauded as one of the founding fathers who exist alongside Jefferson, is the way in which that civil rights movement was about fundamentally transforming American democracy, small d democracy. In our own time, even as we laud King and we support the memorial and the holiday, we don't think about the policy implications and how the gap between our democratic rhetoric and our reality is actually destroying our democracy. So I'll close by saying this idea from Selma to Ferguson and how everybody's talking about race in 2015. People are talking about race because Ferguson is illustrative of all these inequalities that face us, and that in a lot of ways in our popular imagination, we refuse to confront. We believe that we've earned this victory, whether we're saying Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Obama, right? We've somehow gotten our way out of racism, which is why we're so often ready to embrace post-racialism. We want it to end, right? And even in the polling data of young people, yes, they identify less with color, but at the same time, they don't necessarily see why inequality is so pervasive in the African American community. They'll say, well, anybody can make it, and I've got a black friend right here, and I love Obama, anybody can make it. But we have to understand that even as we have, at some sectors of society, achieved more racial integration, the unequal power relations, the institutional racism, the inequality, the injustice that haunted us during the heroic period of the civil rights movement and before continues to thrive and flourish in certain aspects of American democratic institutions in our own time. Thank you. All right.